Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson on Graphing 101. Okay, so this is a quick review on how to read graphs, the Cartesian plane, and all that kind of fun stuff. Right, because for the next 2 units, we'll be working a lot with graphing. Okay, so of course, why do we care about graphs? Right, graphs help us visualize data very quickly, right? And it helps us determine whether or not two things are related. Right? And of course, with that all being said, it helps us present information really easily. And as you can probably imagine, it's very useful in scientific papers and all that, but it can be easily manipulated in different types of social media. Alright, but all we are here to do for this lesson is you're gonna get a review of what's on a graph. Okay, so this graph right here, this typical grid that you see, like the graph you think of when you picture a graph, we call this the Cartesian plane system, or the Cartesian coordinate system. Right? And of course, the x-axis is the horizontal line, whereas the y-axis is the vertical line. Right? And the origin, it is the point where the axis cross. Right? So it'll be this point right here. Right? It'll always be at this point. The origin is always at this point. Right? Where the two big lines cross. Right? And now, as you can see here, because we got two lines, right? The two lines here divide the graph into 4 sections. Right? We call those quadrants. Okay, so those are the sections, right, divided by the two axes. So generally, we refer to this upper right corner as quadrant 1, Q1, quadrant 2, Q2, quadrant 3 is Q3, and quadrant 4. Right, I'm just using Roman numerals here. Alright, so those are quadrants. 4 sections divided up by 2 lines. Okay, and now probably the most important part of a coordinate system or a graph is the ordered pair. Right, so the ordered pair tells us the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate of a point. Right, what this means is that given just 2 numbers, we know exactly where it is on the graph. So let's take point A here. Right, it's 2, 3. Right? And remember, this is x is always the first number, y is always the second number. No exceptions, always a rule. So point A is pretty much saying when x is at 2 and y is at 3. Okay, let's find it. So on our graph here, we go to x is 2. Right? So x is 2, that's where x2 is. Y equals to 3. That's where y3 is. Right? So this little line right here, that's when x is 2. This line right here, that's when y is 3. And where those two lines cross, that is where point A is. Right, so that's 3, 2. Oh, wait, what the? 2, 3. There we go. Wow, okay. I can't believe I almost messed that up. Right, 2, 3. Right, so once again, it's 2. Right, because that's where the x value is. And then 3, that's where the y value is. So, 2, 3. Okay, of course, we got negative numbers as well. Point B is negative 5, 4. So when x is negative 5, which is right here, y is 4, which is right here. So where those two lines meet, right, that's point B. Point C, 3, negative 6. Right, so x is 3, y is negative 6. Right, so 3 is right here, positive 3, and then negative 6 for the y. Right, so be careful of which letter it is. Right, make sure it's always x first and then y. Negative 7, but that one doesn't really matter because we got negative 7 for the x and negative 7 for the y. So those two cross right here. That's point D. Okay, how about zeros? Right, you'll see this a lot. Right, we have some like a 0 in one of our ordered pairs, which actually makes our lives a lot easier. So this is saying when x is 4, y is 0. Okay, x is 4, that's right here. Y is 0, which is right here. Right? So essentially, we're saying when x is at 4, we have no values of y. Right? If y is 0, then it will be along the x-axis. Right? So when one coordinate is 0, then it rests on the other axis. Right? So the y coordinate is 0, because again, the y coordinate, the y-axis, tells us the height. Right? And because it has a height of 0, so it has to be at this height right here. Right? So think of it as this is the first point, this is the second point. Where they meet, right? It's actually this right here. Okay? 0, 9. So now x is 0, y is 9. When x is 0, right? That's when the x is 0 is. Y is 9. That's where the y is. Right? So as you see, when x is 0, right? Then the point rests on the y-axis. Right? Because the left and right, x is the left and right. That one is at 0, so it's right in the middle. Of course, decimals also applies, right? 9.5 and 8.5. So let's look at 9.5. If 9 is here and 10 is here, 9.5 is somewhere right here in the middle. Right, similar to 8.5, it's in between the 8 and the 9. So that's 8.5 right here, and then 9.5 right here. Where those two guys meet, somewhere around here-ish. And whenever we got decimals, as long as it's close enough, it's okay. So last one's an interesting one, 0, 0. When x is 0, it's right here. When y is 0, it's also here. So 0, 0 is actually right in the middle. Right? And of course, this is what the origin is. Right? Remember, origin is when the x and y axes meet, which is at 0, 0. Okay, which quadrants are those at? Okay, so looking at point A. Right? Point A is definitely in this little quadrant here, right? Because that's right here. So quadrant 1, B, right? It's in this quadrant here, 2. C, right? Quadrant 4. And lastly, D, right? In quadrant 3. I guess not lastly, because we still got a few more points to go. Now look at E here, right? E is actually resting on the line here between the quadrant 1 and 2. So there's actually no quadrant it belongs to. Right? Same as F. Because it rests on the line, there's no quadrant it belongs to because it's in both. Well, technically, it's in neither of those quadrants, right? Because that's the line. Okay, lastly, G. Right? G right here is nice and snug in quadrant 1. And as you can imagine, origin has no quadrants, right? Because it's literally excluding from all 4. Okay, and of course we can go backwards as well. All right, let's check out this epic rocket ship. All right, so let's look at point A here. All right, so we look at the x, which is 5, and then the y, which is 9. Okay, so it's just 5, 9. All right, B is 9 for the x, 9 for the y. C is 9 for the x, 5 for the y. D is 1 for the x, -3 for the y. E, 1x, -6 for y. F, -6 for the x and +1 for the y. And G, -3 and +1. Yeah, that's it. Just going backwards. And of course, we can count the amount of squares between them, right? What's the distance between A and B? Right? So between A and B, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 blocks, or 4 squares. Yeah, how about D and C? Have we got diagonal this time? Right? And of course, whenever we see a diagonal like this, we can think of the Pythagorean theorem. Right? So to go from here to here, this distance is 8, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then to go from this point to D, it's also 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and then from there, you can see it's pretty much a triangle, right? The diagonal of a triangle. So we just Pythagoras it. So remember, it's side length squared plus side length squared equals to hypotenuse squared. And we'll work a lot more with the Pythagoras theorem and all that later on in the trigonometry units. So a squared is 8. B squared is also 8. 64 plus 64 is 128. So c squared is 128. So c must be the square root of 128, which is around 11.3. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much it for a quick little review of the Cartesian plane. Right, so right here, please make sure it's school appropriate. You can draw your own diagram and connect the dots that way. Yeah, but that's pretty much it. So all we have to remember, or the most important part of this lesson, is that the first number always refers to the x, and the first number always refers to the y. And you'll be seeing that a lot for the next few lessons. So with that being said, good luck practicing.